So for those of you who may be coming on and are new to the program, Environment for the Americas is a nonprofit organization. We are based in Colorado, but we have partners and staff all over the Western Hemisphere. And of course, our goal is to connect people to birds and nature. So we have representatives you'll see Miguel Mata here from Venezuela. We have Daniela Sosa in Mexico, and Laura Balbulal in the Caribbean. Our goals are our 4 pillars of our organization are conservation, inspiring the next generation, providing ways to protect birds and their habitats, and also making education about migratory birds and their conservation simple for all. And World Migratory Bird Day is one of the ways that we do that. In the last couple of sessions, we've shared our education packets with you. These are education materials that we send all over the Western Hemisphere, from Canada to Argentina and the Caribbean. It includes a variety of multilingual print materials, as well as fun things for the kids and the families, such as our Bird Buddy bracelets, as well as craft activities and other opportunities for educators to reach out in their communities and share our messages every year. We just want to say how much we appreciate all of your support for our conservation education. Many of our materials are the only current and relevant bits of information that groups receive each year. So for example, how to build a bird-friendly community. There's not a lot of educational materials out there about that. And we've created a whole suite of materials from our poster to our education pamphlet. So with your support, we raised over $4,000. That brings 40 education kits to our partners across the Western Hemisphere again. So you can see in this image how it gets used at festivals and activities. Everybody takes the materials, families, adults, kids, and that's the way that we get people involved in taking action for migratory birds. And it's not too late. You're still welcome to contribute. We'd love to have that. One of our donors contributed enough to help us support all of the activities taking place in Chile. We also received enough support that we'll be able to print materials in Brazil, which is going to be hosting a lot of activities. And we're working to provide materials in just so many other countries. We've also already distributed materials in the United States to about 10 organizations. So thank you very much for that support. And of course, we want to thank our partners and sponsors for their contribution and for making World Migratory Bird Day happen. We couldn't do it without all of these agencies and organizations. World Migratory Bird Day has a conservation theme each year. So if you've been following along, or if you've been doing World Migratory Bird Day or familiar with it, or maybe you have one of these posters on the wall, you can see that we present a lot of different topics, but all of them so important to the conservation of migratory birds, whether it's plastic pollution, protecting habitat, or protecting the insects that birds need to survive. And so this year, our World Migratory Bird Day theme, Shared Spaces, Creating Bird-Friendly Cities and Communities, has been extremely popular. We are so appreciative of all the groups that are hosting programs and making their communities more bird-friendly. It's fun to hear from everybody who's doing that. And we invite you to reach out if you want to share some of your activities. And if you're having an event, to get it on the map. Also, thanks to our artist this year, Ana Maria Savarino. She's essential to creating this beautiful art. And I'm going to take a pause here because I have totally forgotten to remind you and to get Miguel on to let people know that there is Spanish translation. So Miguel, let me take a break and let you share that information with everyone.
Sí, muchas gracias, Susan. Estamos contentos de continuar.
Yes, thank you so much, Susan. We are very happy to keep going with the webinars of the World Migratory Bird Day. The topic of this session is very important to all of us, is creating a habitat for birds within our community with urban gardens, our own backyards. And today we have two experts. And if you prefer to listen to Spanish, we invite you to listen to the interpreting channel. The speakers are going to speak in English. To find the interpretation channel, you can go to the lower part of your screen and you'll find a globe. Click on the globe icon and select the Spanish language. There you will find our interpreter, Claudia, who is going to be interpreting for the entire session. And we would love to hear from you what actions you're taking to create a community that is bird friendly. So we will be answering questions in Spanish as well. So feel free to use the chat and you can listen or ask a question in whichever language you prefer. And that's all from me.
Thank you, Miguel.
Susan?
So today we have a great lineup for you as always. We have Eric Wood with the California State University, David Innouye, he'll be talking about the changing phenology of native plants, and Dave Sutherland, who works with Environment for the Americas, to talk about practical tips for native gardening. So if you've noticed, we start with some big science pictures about the topic, and we move a little closer to home, and then we try to bring you a way to take action where you live. We'll conclude with an opportunity for you to ask questions, and then we'll go to our contest winners. So we'll share with you who won our competition on native gardens. So that's always really fun, and we had some great submissions this time. So I'd like to introduce Eric Wood. I met Eric in California, and I'm so impressed with what he has accomplished in his research on native landscaping. And Eric is with California State University, Los Angeles. So Eric, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you everyone for being here. It's great to see so many people from across the US, Canada, hola, ¿cómo están? And Latino America, friends down in Latin America, and this is really great. So thank you for being here. And if we move on to the next slide, I can introduce a little bit about myself. Oh, sorry, the first slide, Susan. So I'm the principal investigator of the Lab of Avian and Urban Ecology at California State University, Los Angeles. And I just want to highlight that the co-authors you see here were all graduate students in my lab. So what you're going to see today is a mash together of a bunch of different data from a bunch of different projects to get at this all important question about native plant landscaping in cities and how that's going to be beneficial to our birds. So if we move on. And here's an overview of Los Angeles, just an image. And it's going to be no surprise to any of us on this webinar that we know that cities have a tremendous effect on biodiversity. And if you're a migratory bird and you're moving through a city, you can imagine that there's going to be some locations where that bird may thrive and some locations where that bird may be having quite a tough time when looking at this. And if we move on to the one thing that I always get a question of is when I look at that first paragraph of a lot of the papers that I write as a conservation biologist, often it's a little bit doom and gloom about how cities are so terrible for biodiversity. There's been a lot of research that it's definitely shown the negative effects, but there's also lots of ways where there are positive effects. So for this question, is it all that bad? The way we like to look at it in my lab is of course not. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So here's an image of Ron Finley. He goes by the name of the Gangster Gardener in South LA. And this is an example of a person who has looked at issues within their community, in particular food insecurity and ways to grow food to benefit the community, to build community, but also with doing this, providing habitat for pollinators, for birds, etc. So there are so many interventions that we can do in our cities that have these radical effects on people and on biodiversity. And that's what I'm going to get to for my talk today, just for the research goal. There's lots of different things we do in my lab, but for the presentation today, we're going to assess the significance of native plant landscaping in urban areas as habitat for birds. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about insects. So next slide, please. So I'm just going to jump right into this idea about mashing together a bunch of different projects. So one of the things that we love to do in my lab is we're a bunch of birders, and so we love to go out and bird watch. And one of the coolest things you can do in terms of a data collection method for bird watching is to quantify bird foraging behavior. You simply watch the bird, you watch it feed, and I'll show a little bit more on the next slide about why this is so cool. But when you're doing that, you're documenting ecology in action, how the bird is finding a food resource on a plant, whether that's a fruit, a seed, nectar, an insect that's living on that plant, whatever that might be. And we do this a lot in my lab. So there's 4 projects that I'm going to highlight to you. So the first is going to be from natural areas where we worked in these natural zones and quantified bird foraging behavior, urban parks, residential yards, street trees, so right in the middle of the city. These are sites all across greater Los Angeles. It's a big area. And if you'll notice from that 1, 2, 3, 4, those 4 habitat types, that's a gradient from low to high development. Okay, so next slide, please, Susan. So what is so cool about that foraging observation? So if you're looking at this Townsend's warbler, what we do often, and this is a migratory bird that spends the winter time in Southern California. And what they're doing during the winter time, which is when we do a lot of our surveys, is they're trying to eat. They're trying to find food. They're trying to get themselves ready through the winter months to get ready for the spring migration where they're eventually going to migrate north and eventually breed. So if you're doing a foraging observation for this bird and it's feeding on this Tasmanian blue gum, which is a eucalyptus tree that's planted throughout California, you can document that interaction that the Townsend's warbler is using this tree. Now, if you do that thousands and thousands of times, you start to get a profile about which plants birds prefer and which ones they tend to shy away from. So where do we work? Let's look at the next couple slides and I'll show you some of the locations. In our natural areas, I'm going to use data from a graduate student, Natasha Kanadang, who went to 9 open spaces throughout Los Angeles. She counted and measured over 17,500 trees and shrubs. So she measured how big they are and also the identity of the plants on these walking trails. So that's the availability of the trees and shrubs to birds that are feeding. She then quantified over 1,000 bird foraging observations to come up with this idea about what they're using versus what's available. Classic wildlife methods that we're going to apply to some urban ecology. So next slide. Then we do the same thing in residential yards. These are published data right here from Noriko Smallwood. She worked in 31 residential yards, just the front yards in Los Angeles, mainly landscaped with native plants. And she quantified nearly 500 trees and shrubs in those areas and a little over 100 bird foraging observations. Note that the numbers are smaller here because the yards are much smaller than those open spaces. Okay, next slide. Thank you. We worked in urban parks where Amy Vasquez completed her graduate work in 34 parks. She quantified over 7,000 trees and shrubs and nearly 2,500 bird foraging observations, all the same types of methodology. And then last, getting into the middle of the city, in the last slide, we are looking at street trees. These are those trees on the median strip, which I believe you'll find across most cities in the United States and Canada. Not as familiar with many big cities in Latin America, but just imagine your big street trees that might be in the center of a park or trees that might be in the center of a town. So this graduate student, Savan Essian, he walked around 25 neighborhoods on these set routes, measured over 7,500 of these street trees and quantified bird foraging observations on over 1,500 birds. So we're talking about thousands and thousands of trees and shrubs and thousands of bird foraging observations. Now, what can we learn from these? If we go to the next slide, on the x-axis here, we're just going to look at the proportion of native plants, and I'm just going to show the relationships that as the proportion of native plants increases in these different study areas, you're going to get more bird feeding observations. On the y-axis, note that the numbers are kind of funky. That's just because we had to scale the different locations for where we were finding, where we were doing this work because there were such different areas. So in the natural areas, just a slight trend for a positive slope, but note how many, the proportion of native plants is very high in the natural areas. So we kind of expected them to just sort of be there, birds feeding on the trees. We didn't expect to find a big positive relationship here. Just thinking about coevolution, and birds are going to feed on most of the native plants in these areas. If we focus on the next one for street trees, note that there are much fewer native street trees in Los Angeles, but right when you start getting a higher proportion of those, you start noticing that there's a positive trend. You're going to find more birds feeding in those areas. For urban parks, which is next, we did not find much of a relationship here. There are tons of exotic plants in our parks, but also lots of native plants. And I can explain a little bit more about this in another talk, but I just want to focus on the next one, which is most important, and that's going to be our yards. And this is a funny relationship here, and you get a little bit of a scatter. That's why the p-value is what it is. But we start finding quite a positive relationship when we're looking at our yards. And the main take home from all of these data and all of these projects is that native plants, of course, are going to be good when we're thinking about the interior of our cities and what they could potentially do for our birds. So if we move on, Susan, please, to the next couple slides. And yeah, that'll just be that last animation. Okay, and so what I want to focus on are the residential yards, and I want to focus on this paper from Noriko Smallwood, The Ecological Role of Native Plant Landscaping in Residential Yards to Birds During the Non-Breeding Period. So in Los Angeles and cities all across, I'll just go ahead and say the world, landscaping with native plants is gaining much more traction. So if we move on to the next slide, in LA, what a lot of people are doing is they're converting their front yards from looking like grass to more native grasses, to more native shrubs, and to more native plants. They're great areas. This is not my house. I wish it was. But you will note that they're great places for kids to play, but also great places for some of our wildlife. So when we started doing work on this, and when we focus on the next slide, we would drive around Los Angeles and start setting up our study. And we started quantifying about 70% of the city was residential. And what felt like to us was that 99% of the city looked like this: grass or rocks or something where you were not going to find your native plants. This was 10 years ago. Now, as we fast forward to the next slide, what a lot of people are doing is this, where they're converting those native landscapes. A lot of people are doing that for water savings reasons. There's rebates throughout town or throughout different programs in the city to save money if you're doing something like this, and also to convert your yards. But of course, as a biodiversity person and someone with a goal to and try to improve cities for both people and biodiversity, this is gold. So how does doing this affect our birds? So if we look at the next slide, if we look at the box plot on your left, and we're looking at the percentage of bird feeding observations in our native yards, more of those bird feeding observations are going to be on the native plants than the non-native plants. And for those of you that are going to be familiar with these, the Latin names for the plants, these are going to be our oaks, quercus, heteromyles is toyon, salvia is a true sage, Arctostaphylos manzanita, and Eriogonum, which is going to be a buckwheat. And if we look at this in a regression context, which is going to be the image on the right, that's figure B, we note that as you increase the percent cover of plants, the more native plants you get, which are going to be the purple dots, you're going to have more bird feeding observations. Dips a little bit there on the right, but overall it's a positive slope. So unsurprisingly, birds love to forage for prey items in our native plants. And this isn't real rocket science here. There's been lots of research done about this. Think of Doug Tallamy's work with Bring Nature Home, and that's something we're finding here. So if we move on, I'm just about done to wrap up. I'm looking at the time here. So what we think, and what a lot of people think, is that if you just look at the city and you look at a lot of the houses, most of them are going to be, of course, covered by the actual built unit, but then there's lots of green space that's embedded within neighborhoods too. So if we were able to convert some of these yards or continue to have this happen, we're going to really improve habitat for our birds and our migratory birds. So just a teaser about the work that we're doing next to follow up on this. How about the insects? Of course, for our pollinators who are going to be experiencing that yard at a different scale than our birds. Well, if we just focus on a little bit of research, working on the exact same yards where we did the bird research, on the next slide, we can see that if we're comparing these grass landscaped yards, which is the brown to the left of that dotted line, and then the native plant landscape yards, which is the green, we're going to see that, of course, there's going to be more flower color richness, more plant richness in total. And in turn, that's going to influence the flower visits by family. That's going to be the richness of insects that are going to be visiting flowers and all the total overall abundance. And that's going to make sense. Anyone who's been in a native plant garden in a city will just note the butterflies, the bumblebees, the bees, the hummingbirds, etc. And if we ask this question about how much more complex is a pollinator network in a native landscape yard, here's your answer right here. In the native landscape yard on the left, this is just looking at a network analysis. way more interactions going on than the conventionally landscaped yards, about 7 times the amount of interactions. Of course, there's lots more plants in those yards, so you're going to see lots more interactions. But if you scale these two to be the same number of plants, you still get 3 times the complexity in the native landscape gardens. So the take home from all this is that what we're doing with native landscape in our cities has great effects, positive effects on our birds and our pollinators. And it's something that I think many of us in this room are already thinking about or already potentially doing, but we should encourage this as much as we potentially can. Thank you.
And thank you, Eric. Really appreciate that presentation. That's just fascinating work. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I noticed already in the chat box that people were asking for some access to your to your work. So if you have a chance while we move on to David Innouye's presentation, if you have a chance to put those links in there, that would be excellent if you could do that. And David, you are our next presenter. We're excited to have you today. David Innouye is an amazing researcher who has done a considerable amount of long-term research, and we're excited to have him. We also work with him in our Western Hummingbird Partnership efforts, and he's well known as a hummingbird researcher. So, David, I want to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the work that I'm doing at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory in the Colorado Rocky Mountains. And I'll talk mostly about how the wildflowers that these hummingbirds depend on are being influenced by the changing climate. So next slide, please. I'll talk about native plants and birds, in particular hummingbirds, in the changing climate that we're seeing here. The next slide. This is a picture of a broad-tailed hummingbird male. Those are the species that reproduce here during the summer. This bird is a good pollinator. You can see it's got a dusting of pollen here under its chin. And the broad-tailed hummingbirds are notable because the males make a wing whistle when they fly. And here in this circle, you can see the slot between the first and second primary feathers, which is what makes that mechanical whistle when the birds are flying. My study site is in southwest Colorado in the West Elk Mountains. Those of you that are skiers may have heard of the Crested Butte ski area, and so Crested Butte Mountain is highlighted there. And then Gothic Mountain overlooks the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory where I've done research. Next slide. This is a view of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. It's at 9,500 feet. This is what it looks like this time of year, but during much of the year, it's about 6 months of the year, you'd see all these peaks and buildings covered with snow. Next slide. So I think everybody probably understands that the climate is changing, that the climate at your local area is a combination of global climate factors and regional climate factors. In our area, the North Pacific Oscillation, which is a 50 to 75 year cycle, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a 2 to 7 year cycle, also something called the quasi-biennial oscillation. So all of those interact to create our local climate and influence how much snow we get, when that snow melts, how much rain we get, what the temperature is. And those environmental variables influence the phenology of migration, such as the migratory hummingbirds, and also influence the phenology or the seasonal timing of events like flowering by all the wildflowers. And the next slide shows phenological. Oh, sorry, it doesn't show. That other slide showed a sort of a phenological calendar of the different species that we see across the seasons, starting at the top with spring beauties and willows and glacier lilies and winding all the way around to gentians at the end. So not all those are visited by hummingbirds, but they're certainly all important for pollinators in general. Okay, next slide. The way we've studied this since 1973 is to go around 3 times a week and count every flower that blooms in these 2 by 2 meter plots. And that's given us a long-term record of variation in both the timing of flowering, the flowering phenology, and the abundance of flowers. And we've been able to use that record then to look and see how were those variables influenced by the climate. Next slide. Oh, here's that phenological progression of wildflowers I mentioned. So for pollinators, including the hummingbird, in the middle on the left, a queen bumblebee shown there, and also a butterfly species that I've helped work on. Next slide. The first flower that migratory hummingbirds would encounter when they come up to this elevation is the glacier lily, and they'll visit it, as you can see in the next slide, but they're actually not very good pollinators. Oh, sorry, that wasn't the next slide. This shows you how abundant those glacier lilies can be in the meadows up here. And then here's a picture of a broad-tailed hummingbird visiting it. And you can see that the little orange circle below the hummingbird's head, which is where the stigma is not touching the hummingbird. So they're actually not very good pollinators, even though they're visiting those flowers and taking some nectar. I think the next slide shows the species that is a very good pollinator, which includes this bumblebee queen. Next slide. So we've kept track of when during the year do we see the first flower of those glacier lilies, and when do we see the first male hummingbirds arriving. And those two dates are plotted against the variable on the bottom axis, the x-axis, of how much snow was left on the 30th of April. And so there can be close to 2 meters of snow, over 6 feet of snow left on the ground on the 30th of April. Some years, other years, it'll all be melted by then. And in both cases, the flowering starts later if there's more snow and it takes longer to melt, and the hummingbirds arrive later. But an important point to note here is that those lines are not parallel, meaning that they're not responding the same way to snow and snow melt dates. So if this trend continues, it could be that the flowers will be blooming well before the hummingbirds arrive. Maybe the hummingbirds will eventually actually miss the opportunity to collect nectar from this particular flower. Next slide. The hummingbirds, probably second in the sequence, would visit the larkspur shown here, the Delphinium natalianum, and they can pollinate these flowers. They also get nectar from them. But there's a lot of variation in the abundance of these flowers. So here's data from a plot where every year since 1991, I've gone and counted how many flowers are there, how many flowering plants are there of that larkspur. And you can see some years there are over 300, other years there are maybe only fewer than 10. So lots of variation. The next slide shows what's responsible for some of that variation. If you plot what's the maximum number of flowers, in this case, flowers per stalk, against how much snow we got the previous winter, the more snow, the better the flowering. And I haven't been able to figure out yet what the reason is behind that correlation. All I can say is that here's an observation. We know that if you get less snow, you have fewer flowers. The next slide. The same is true for the average number of flowers made by each plant, the flowers per inflorescence. If there's more snow, there are more flowers. And because we've been getting less snow over the last few decades, there's been a decline in the average number of flowers per inflorescence and in the total number of flowers in those plots. So the next slide shows a picture of a later flowering species of larkspur, the Delphinium barbii, which, as is shown in the next picture, is also visited commonly by hummingbirds, in this case, a female broad-tailed hummingbird. And its abundance is also highly variable from year to year. The next slide shows another species of local wildflower that the birds use. We don't have the abundance data for this one, so I can't show you a graph of how variable it is, but we do know that its abundance is variable from year to year, as well as the timing of when it comes into bloom. And the next slide, another species of wildflower, the red columbine that is visited by the hummingbirds. And you can see that this female has a yellow dusting under her throat from the pollen that she's picked up from visiting other individuals of that flower species. The next slide. The area where I work in Southwest Colorado turns out to be very close to a real hot spot here in North America in terms of temperature change from 1895 up to 2019. And so that's one indication of the kind of climate change that we're seeing, that temperatures are getting hotter. I think the next slide shows another climate variable. In this case, how many rainy days are there during the summer? And these data go back to about 1910 at a weather station in Crested Butte, Colorado. And I just counted up how many days between May and September were rainy days. And over the last 30 years, there's been a pretty straight linear decline in that variable. But if you go all the way back to 1910, you can see that there's been a variety of kinds of changes in that number of rainy days. Next slide shows mean consecutive days with no rain in Crested Butte. And that also has a long-term trend since 1910, but seems to be turning around since about 1980 and heading towards a larger number of days, consecutive days with no rain, as summers may tend to become drier. Next slide. Snowmelt is the date when the snow disappears is a very important measurement up here, because it sets the beginning of the growing season, also the beginning of the flowering season. And if you look at how that's changed since a friend up here has measured it every year since 1974, it's highly variable. It's been as early as the 23rd of April and as late as the 19th of June. But the overall trend here is towards an earlier snowmelt, partly because we're getting less snow and also because the temperatures are getting warmer. And that cascades down to affect the flowering dates and also the flowering abundance of some of these species, and therefore is affecting the resources available for those hummingbirds. There's a lot of hummingbird research going on here at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. And you can see that this male broad-tailed hummingbird visiting my feeder has a little bracelet, which has a letter and 5 numbers on the band on its leg. And maybe you can see on its back, because the feathers are a little ruffled, we have glued what's called a pit tag. So this is the kind of tag that some of your pets may have, that a veterinarian can scan your pet to identify your pet. Excuse me. But here we can recognize individual hummingbirds as they come to feeders that have a pit tag reader on them. And we've been looking at how the hummingbirds are responding to differences in the timing of flowering. And you can see in that upper left graph all the different species that the hummingbirds visit during the summer and when they come into bloom, or how long they stay in bloom. And another interesting graph done by a graduate student who worked on hummingbirds here shows the relationship between corolla length, how long are the tubes on those flowers, versus when they come into bloom. And you can see that there's a trend over the season for the hummingbird flowers to be longer in length later in the season. So in conclusion, we know that migratory hummingbirds are changing their phenology. They're arriving earlier than they used to. We know that the wildflowers that they depend on for nectar are also changing, both in terms of their abundance and their timing of flowering, but not in synchrony with the hummingbird migration. And the floral resource phenology, the timing of flowering, and the abundance are dependent on environmental cues, like how much snow we get and when that snow melts. And those variables are changing. So climate change is likely to produce earlier flowering and also less abundant flowering of some of these hummingbird flowers. So that's of concern for those of us that like to see lots of hummingbirds. Uh, this is likely to change the coevolutionary relationship between plants and hummingbirds, as well as other pollinators like flies and bumblebees and butterflies, because the timing of the flowers they depend on is changing. The abundance of those flowers is changing. So what they're finding is a slightly different community of flowers when they get here every summer now. And that means there's lots for the scientists to study here at the biological lab, but also raises a variety of concerns about the future of those wildflowers and their pollinators. For those of you that want to learn a little bit more about the work that we've been doing and the work that's done here at the biological lab, Rocky Mountain Public Broadcasting System put out a video last year, last August, about this research, and a picture that they took showing my son, who's also an ecologist and starting to continue some of the long-term projects here. So if you do a search, I'm pretty sure you can pick up the video story that they put out about that. There's also one about the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory, which might be of interest to you. I think the next slide may show something about that. Their program called Colorado Experience had a story about the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab and there's a URL for where to find that story. So I'd be happy to try and answer questions if you have some later, or feel free to get in touch with me and I'll try and answer questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Your work is so incredibly fascinating. We'll take questions at the end, and you might, if you don't want to ask your questions in person, you can put them in the chat box. And in the meantime, we're going to move on to our last speaker, who is David Sutherland. David works with Environment for the Americas, but he wears a number of other hats, including the one that you see here. He is, among many things, a wonderful birder as well as a long-term native gardener. So, David.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everybody. Thanks for your interest. Quiero dar una gran bienvenida a todos nuestros compañeros
I
en
want to
Latinoamérica.
welcome
Gracias por su
all our
interés en este
partners
tópico.
and listeners in Latin America.
I have a 28-year-old native plant garden in Boulder, Colorado. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the things I've learned to sort of draw from David and Eric's talk and kind of sum it all up in terms of practical implications about what they were just telling you in terms of what you can do in your own garden. And so what I'm talking about specifically is Boulder, Colorado, but native plants grow all over the world. So you can live in Boulder, Colorado, you can live in Michigan, you can live in Michoacan, you can live in Quito, Ecuador. All of these places have native plants, and wherever you live, you can find natives, a huge palette of native plants that you can use in landscaping. I initially got interested in native plant gardening when I lived in the Galapagos Islands and was trying to grow Galapagos native plants in a landscape, and that was kind of my bridge into this. So it doesn't matter where you live, you will have lots of great plants to pick from. The photograph here is one of the prairies near Boulder, Colorado, blooming in spring, and every one of the flowers and plants that you see in that picture would be suitable for a native plant garden. Can we get the next slide? This is a photograph of the strip along the front of my yard. It's on a busy sidewalk on a busy street in urban central Boulder. So I'm living in a really urban environment. You don't need to have a beautiful, pristine farm up in the mountains to grow native plants. You can do it in scraps of land right in the city. And everything in that photograph is native to Boulder County, Colorado. It's all native plants. And you can see there's a lot of diversity in there. There's probably about 10 different species just in that photograph, which brings me, I guess, to my big point, and this is going to sort of build on everything that David and Eric said. If you want to have a diverse garden, you should grow a diverse garden. The more different kinds of plants that you have in there translate into opportunities for different kinds of birds and insects and spiders and other kinds of organisms that will come to live in your garden. So go for diversity. And we'll talk a little bit about specifically what that diversity means. So can I get the next slide? If you're trying to attract birds to your garden, you've got to remember that birds eat a whole diversity of different kinds of foods. There are birds that eat fruit and birds that eat insects and caterpillars. There are birds that eat seeds. Next slide. And they're nectar feeding birds. And you can attract all of them to your garden by providing a diversity of plants that will be providing food for them. Many different kinds of birds will come eating different kinds of foods. And the more different, I guess you could compare it to a restaurant. The more different things you have on your menu, the more different kinds of birds you're going to bring in. And the longer you'll be able to keep them there, as what David was talking about, the phenology. If you have a diverse garden, it will be providing diverse opportunities all throughout the season. There may be leaves for insects to eat. There may be flowers for pollinators to visit. There may be flowers or fruits for birds to come and eat. So you're just providing a lot of opportunity. Can I get the next slide? This is sort of a classic case of host plant and providing diversity in a garden. This is the monarch butterfly that here in North America is a butterfly that's vanishing because the host plants that it feeds on, plants in the milkweed family, are vanishing. Next slide. The flowers on the milkweed are incredibly rich flowers for a whole diversity of pollinators. My milkweed plants out in the front yard are just covered with all different kinds of bees and flies and butterflies all the time. And the leaves offer host plants for things like monarch caterpillars, but there are also a whole bunch of different kinds of insects, monarch bugs and monarch beetles, that are attracted to the milkweed plant. And so if you were to grow this kind of a native plant in your garden, you're providing a home and food for a whole range of different kinds of insects. And of course, the different insects will attract different kinds of birds. Next slide. This is another native Colorado plant of the Front Range. It's called a white evening primrose. And if you look at where all of the anthers and the pistil on that flower are sticking out, you can tell that whatever it is that's pollinating that is something that has to get its face right into the flower. Remember the pictures that David showed us of the hummingbirds with the pollen all over their chins. And so I discovered, surprisingly, what is pollinating this flower in my garden. And there's a story to it. Next slide. So I worked very hard to get these beautiful primroses established in my native plant garden. And then to my horror, I discovered these hornworm caterpillars eating the leaves. And my initial response was, oh my God, I've got to kill all these caterpillars. They're destroying the plants. I worked so hard. And my 8-year-old daughter said, no, Dad, let's collect the caterpillars and grow them out in a jar and see what they turn into. Next slide. They turn into the moth that pollinates the flower. And so I had this ecological relationship going on in my garden, right under my nose. I was completely unaware of it, in which the moth comes and pollinates that flower. Big white flowers like that are often moth pollinated. They show up at night for nocturnal pollinators. And so the moth would come, get pollen all over its face and spread it around from the flowers while it was getting nectar, and then come back and lay its eggs on the leaf of the very, very same plant. There was a huge lesson right there about ecological linkages and relationships that can be promoted in a native plant garden, something that you can promote if you're growing these plants. But the other thing, the huge paradigm shift for me was it's not just okay, it's desirable to have insects show up and start eating the plants in your native plant garden because you're then feeding the greater ecosystem. So I realized that by leaving the insects alone on my plants and letting them go to it, letting them chow down on my native plants and eat the flowers and eat the leaves, I was feeding birds that would come to eat those caterpillars. I might be feeding the insects themselves. Some of the insects will grow up to be moths that are going to feed bats. And so by providing host plants and feeding the insects, you're in turn feeding the birds that you're trying to attract to your yard at the same time. Huge paradigm shift to learn that if you want to have birds, you have to have insects. And if you want to have insects, you need to grow native plants and let the insects come and eat them. Next slide. Another reason to grow a diverse garden is that you want to provide a lot of different sort of habitat options for the critters that you're trying to invite into your yard. So my garden has trees and shrubs and wildflowers, things of different heights, things that provide cover for birds that will come and hang out in the trees before they fly out to nectar on the flowers or eat the seeds. And they may grab some seeds off of a sunflower and then zip back into the trees. Or hide out in the shrubs. They have places where they can nest, they have places they can feed. And so providing structure, big stuff, little stuff, in between stuff, is providing places where pollinators and birds can take cover in your garden and have a multitude of different kinds of resources where they can live and hang out and spend their time. Next slide. Another great reason to go for diversity is the whole phenology connection that David was talking about in his research. So what I've got here are 4 different native flowers that bloom in my garden, but they bloom at different times. So the little yellow tubular flowers in the upper corner, that's a little native shrub in Colorado called golden currant. It's one of the very, very first little tubular flowers to bloom in spring. And so hummingbirds are coming to feed on it, but also some of the earliest pollinators, some of the earliest bees, some of the butterflies that hibernated over the winter are feeding on these very early spring flowers. And then the golden currants die back, but hey, that's okay because then my larkspurs and other kind of middle spring flowers come out, and then the hummingbirds move over and they're feeding on the larkspurs. I've got moths feeding on the larkspurs and all of the other kinds of things that are blooming in the middle of spring. And then we got on into kind of the hot doldrums of summer when Colorado can, be 100 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. But we've got stuff blooming then too. And so then the hummingbirds move over to my bee balm plants. They're still blooming. And a lot of the other pollinators are moving on to that. And as the bee balms die back, new things start showing up. We get into a whole fall bloom in Colorado. And so what I've got here is a picture of a painted lady butterfly on a fall blooming rabbit brush that blooms all the way into November in my yard. And it's not uncommon for me to have butterflies in the late fall in October all over my rabbit brush, nectaring and spreading the pollen. And so if you grow a diverse garden, you're providing opportunities throughout the entire growing season so that no matter what kind of insect or bird you have visiting your yard, you're providing something for it to eat at all these different times. And that's something you really want to do is make sure that whoever's visiting your garden is going to find something to eat at whatever time of the year it is. Next slide. So people would then ask me, well, I live in Michoacan, or I live in Quito, or I live in Madrid, or I live in Michigan or Colorado. What kind of plants should I be growing? You want to use local plants from your local ecosystem, local native plants, and to figure out which are the best ones, the ones that you like, and the ones that seem to be providing for the ecosystem, I would say go for a walk. Go for a walk out in a local, natural place where you're going to see a lot of local wildflowers, trees, and shrubs growing, and just pay attention. See what is blooming at what time of year, and tell yourself, well, if I want to have spring flowers, these are some of the native plants that are blooming in my local park, my national park, my state park, or whatever. And so I'm going to see if I can get those into my garden. What's blooming in the middle of summer? What's living in the full sun? I can put those kinds of plants into a full sun garden where they're going to get blasted with heat. What's growing in the dry shade? I can put those kinds of plants into the dry shade of my garden. And here's an example. This is a local Colorado forest, just close to my home, up under the pine trees. People are always asking me, Dave, what can I grow in the dry shade in my yard? I have all this dry shade and I can't think of anything to grow. And I'd say, well, go for a walk. Go for a walk up in the pine forest at different times of year under the shade of those trees. Any sort of wild flower or wild plant that you see growing under those trees is by definition a dry shade plant, and you can grow it in dry shade in your garden. And so you can translate what you see in this picture here, all of those different wildflowers and some of the shrubs in the backyard, into what I learned to plant in my native plant garden in the dry shade. Next slide, please. So I ended up with a lot of dry shade in my garden, and right here in this completely fully dry shade area in my yard, I've got a whole bunch of the different native plants that you just saw in the previous picture. Again, everything in that photograph is a Colorado native plant. And I figured out what I can grow there by going for a walk. Another thing to consider too is that there may be a lot of local resources where you live. There are probably garden clubs. There may be groups that are trying to garden with native plants that have websites, and you can try to tie into a local community of people who are already doing this stuff. Um, People who are trying it out, people who are learning from their mistakes, people who may have free plants or free seeds to give you and a lot of advice. There may even be some landscaping companies in your area that are starting to specialize in gardening with native plants. So no matter where you live, you can find resources that will give you a hand. Next slide. And I guess the final tip I want to give you is be patient because, I think I didn't really start seeing an increase in what was coming to my garden for maybe the first 3 to 5 years. Now I've got a 28-year-old native plant garden. The trees and shrubs have grown up. Everything's bearing fruit. I've got plants blooming all season long. And I have been utterly astonished, anecdotally, to be able to agree with Eric's research about native plant gardens with more diversity in them, with a greater number of native plants, attract a lot more birds. Over the last 28 years, I have seen a huge increase in the number of birds, as well as the number of kinds of pollinating insects that visit my yard, as the yard has kind of come into its own, and the native plants have grown up and really established and asserted themselves. I've built a habitat, and you can do it too, even if you live in the middle of the city. Okay? Thank you very much. And I'm going to post my website here in the comments so that you can get on and see some more photographs of my garden and connect to the resource page that I put up on my website.
Thank you so much, Dave. I think I'll just echo Gwendolyn's comment that we're all aspiring to your garden. So thank you so much. I'm going to bring up our speakers for questions. And so, Eric, if you want to turn your video on, that would be great. I'll start with some of what's already come up. Some folks, especially maybe our Latin American partners, are saying they don't know where to go to get native plants. That message came in from Guanajuato, from somewhere else. Okay, I see your message, Eric, that you can't turn your video on. Let me see if I can help you. Um, but do you have any insights into that as to what we could do or where they can go in some other parts of the Western Hemisphere to find nurseries that have native plants?
Well, can I jump in on that one?
Absolutely.
One of the things I did when I got started, because I started almost 30 years ago, and there really weren't any nurseries in Colorado that carried native plants. So I got a lot of my first plants by collecting seeds. You have to be careful to collect seeds from places where it's permitted or to ask permission, but you can collect a lot of wild seeds and grow them out in a seed bed. I grew them just like I would grow radishes in a seed bed. I had a nice sunny patch, and I planted all of my natives seeds in rows and let them just sit out. I planted them in fall and let nature take care of them with cold stratification and raining and snowing on them. And a whole bunch of my native plants came up in the following spring. And because I planted them in rows, I could recognize them as seedlings and distinguish them from weeds because all of my larkspurs came up in a row and I could see what larkspurs look like. And all of my smooth asters came up in a row and I could see what smooth asters looked like. And it didn't cost me anything to be able to collect the seeds. You may find local resources who are already collecting and distributed seeds. I know we've got groups in Colorado who are doing that. Another thing that I did to get some of my initial native plants was there were areas around Boulder that were being developed. They were putting a big housing development in on one site, and I saw them moving the bulldozers out, and the place was just thick with native plants. So I asked permission of the landowners and grabbed picks and shovels and a bunch of friends, and we descended on this area and dug up as many native plants as we could pack into wheelbarrows before the bulldozers ran over them and put them into our gardens. So in many places, it's illegal to dig up wild plants like that unless it's a place that's going to be developed and you have permission from the landowners to go in and collect there.
Thanks, Dave. That's very helpful. I'm wondering if in the chat box you could put any information, if you have any, or a link to any place that helps with how to collect seeds. What's the best way to do that? And then I'm going to direct a question to Eric. Eric, it was fascinating to see the change in the gardens in Los Angeles, and that's so nice to see some of those gardens turn from total turf to native plants. Um, I know that there are incentives there, but are there other ways that you have been able to convince people, or have you tried, or are you just uh, doing the studies and the cities working on that? But what makes people move towards making that big change?
That's a good question, and I think it's pretty slow moving. It's something where, so for example, we converted our yard to native plants probably 8 years ago. It was just turf, and we did the conversion, and a lot of our neighbors were interested in what we were doing. And I was telling my wife at the time that I really think everybody in the neighborhood's going to do this now, and because look at how pretty our yard is, and not a single family has done it. And so I think for a lot of people, there's probably already a built-in love of nature, desire to do something a little bit different, whether it's water savings, whether it's coming from a cost savings point of view, or that just really are inspired by butterflies and birds like David and Dave would be, and myself, who would already do that. Otherwise, I think it's pretty slow going. I want more and more people to do this, but whenever I give these talks, there seems to be a lot of interest, but it seems to be the people that have already done it rather than the people who, are busy with their lives. It's easier just to have turf. It's easier just to have somebody come and mow your lawn and use the leaf blower and then just kind of get on with your day-to-day stuff. So it's a little bit of an uphill battle, but what we're trying to do, and there was something in the comments about this, is we're trying to get our data as much as possible into the management guidelines that people are giving out, whether it's through the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power or just through the City Hall office, because they do a lot of promotion for these things, often with no data behind it. And so we're just trying to help with some of that, and hopefully it'll catch on. But it's hard. It's an uphill battle.
Oh, that's excellent. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that information. It's a good idea to reach out to some of those groups that have big public service announcements. David, in a way, I wanted to direct a question to you in terms of phenology. And can you clarify, how much do you think hummingbirds with this changing phenology of flowering plants, how much are they able to move to other sources of flowering plants to take care of what they need during breeding, migration, and the rest of their life cycle?
I think they're pretty flexible in terms of their foraging behavior. And of course, they run into these same issues year round, including in Mexico and the mountains where they're overwintering, and then all along the migratory corridor that they have to follow uh, a progression of blooming plants as they come into bloom as the hummingbirds move north, and then hopefully get to their breeding grounds at an appropriate time in terms of the flowering sequence. Um, but I think they're going to do what they have to do to survive. Um, there are a number of pollinator species that we know are moving either up in altitude or north in latitude in North America in order to stay within their comfort zone in terms of their physiology, and then probably also in terms of being able to match the resources that they need to survive. So I have seen one black-chin hummingbird up here in the last several years, and that's a species that is characteristic of lower altitudes, but it could be that they're starting to move up in altitude to respond to this changing floral environment that they're encountering.
Mhm. Yeah, and I imagine we'll see that with other groups of birds as well. I'll move to Pamela's question. Any thoughts on the issue of nativars, nursery derived cultivars of native species, and the need to cut through the hype for well-intentioned folks who may not understand the difference? Is anybody able to take that one on?
Well, I think there are some concerns about trying to maintain the genetic integrity of populations so that they can evolve naturally. And if you bring in a cultivar that's adjusted or adapted or evolved for a different kind of environment than you're moving it to, you're at risk of disrupting the local genetics of a population. So I think as a rule of thumb, when people are working in restoration ecology, they try to work with relatively locally sourced material as a way of preserving the genetic adaptations that those local populations have.
Anybody else want to pitch in on that one?
I don't know about so much about cultivars, but there's a really interesting project that a postdoc here in LA is working on where they're looking at kind of getting onto what Dave Sutherland was saying, but also what David was just mentioning. They're looking at seeds from the local mountains and how pollinators are using those versus, for the same species of plants for those from a little bit further away. So it's almost like a common garden experiment, but it's getting at that question about um, true nativeness and what that means when we're thinking about the genetics of the population, who's using it, how they're breeding, et cetera. And so I can't say about the cultivars. I don't know that much about it, but I know that people are trying to get at this question, and I think it's an important one.
I'd like to jump in on that too. I recently went to a presentation at the Colorado Native Landscaping Conference where some very initial research on cultivars and pollinators was coming out. It was really interesting. It's an area that's ripe for research, and there hasn't been much done on it. The results were a little bit inconclusive, but generally showed that native pollinators tended to favor wild type plants over cultivars, although it wasn't a completely hard and fast relationship. There were a couple of cultivars that were actually favored over the wild type, but the general trend was native wild type is better. And I would also add to simply as a gardener, from a gardener's perspective, if you're dealing with the native wild type in your area, it's adapted to your local conditions. We've got a plant here in Colorado that I grow in my garden. It's the native yarrow. It's a beautiful little wildflower, and it grows from the prairie all the way up to the tundra. So it has this enormous altitudinal range. But if I were to go up into the tundra and dig up a yarrow plant that grows at 12,000 feet and move it down to my garden at 5,000 feet in Boulder and plant it, it would probably die because even though it's the same species, that particular population at high altitude isn't adapted to the kind of heat and dryness that it's going to be facing down here. And if I were to take yarrow from my garden here and try to grow it up in the tundra, it wouldn't be able to adapt to the cold, to the longer winters, to the snowpack. So if you're just trying to grow a plant that's going to do better in your area, that's just going to be tougher and be able to survive anything that your local climate throws at it, I'd say stick with the wild type. If you only thing you can find is a cultivar, it's probably better to grow a cultivar than to grow a non-native, and certainly a non-native invasive. But yeah, cultivar is probably better than nothing, but wild type would be my choice in every case.
Thanks. Thank you for those answers. And I see a lot of comments going into the chat box, especially about where to find your plants. Some options in the United States for getting native planting boxes. And again, a comment about the research being so helpful in forming their audiences. Um, and how when we can relate them to the research about adding natives, it's so helpful.
Sue, could
Um,
I jump in with another comment about where to get the plants?
yeah, absolutely.
I've seen a number of comments, both in English and Spanish, saying, our local nurseries don't carry native plants. And so, one of the things that we can do as consumers is we can start going to those nurseries and demanding native plants. If all of us go in and start saying, hey, would you start carrying some native plants? If they hear that enough, they're going to start doing it. And another related issue is that a lot of nurseries sell plants that are treated with neonic herbicides, at least here in the United States. And pesticides will actually poison the pollinators. They're systemic insecticides that get into the plant and make the whole plant toxic. And some nurseries are now carrying plants that have not been treated with neonics. The more that we as consumers who are sourcing our plants can go into these places and say, hey, are these treated with neonics or not? Start sending a message to the people in the nursery industry that there's a demand for native plants in your area and a demand for plants that aren't treated with toxic chemicals that are going to be killing the very pollinators you're trying to help.
Thanks, Dave. And I'm going to add for our Latin American partners to reach out to your botanic gardens. They have botanists who are are really well informed and gardens themselves. And I don't know if any of them do any plant sale opportunities, but that might be a great opportunity to work with your local botanic garden. I know there's a wonderful array of botanic gardens across Latin America, so be sure to reach out to them as well. I'm going to thank our speakers. We're a little bit over our time, and I want to make sure that I have the opportunity to share our contest winners from our native garden contest. So thank you so much, Eric, Dave, and Dave, for your participation today. It's been just really fantastic. So thank you. Thank you so much. I'm going to remove your spotlight here, and y'all can continue to communicate in, oh, I can't get yours off, David. Where are you? Maybe somebody else who's in the background can help me remove Dave's spotlight. Thanks so much. I'm going to bring up our contest winners. So we have picked two winners. We picked Daniela Gomez from La Paz, Baja California, who wrote that planting native plants in her garden means the arrival of different birds that take advantage of them throughout the year. In spring, it's captivating to see the aloe vera bloom as hummingbirds and calandrias, I'm assuming that's orioles, Miguel, arrive to feed on its flowers. It is gratifying to know that we are contributing to the feeding of these beautiful winged creatures and encouraging them to visit our home, which is ultimately also their home. So thank you, Daniela, for your beautiful words and your wonderful garden in La Paz. I'm sure we'd all love to come see it. And second from the United States in Wappingers Falls, I don't know if I said that correctly, New York, Xenia Gutowski, and Xenia is a flower too, a zinnia, who sends in this beautiful picture of bluebirds on one of New York's native trees. And this crabapple is an important source of insects, including butterflies and moths. And the fruit of the crabapple is also a source of food for birds. So we'll be sending prizes to both of you. Thank you so much for participating, sending in your photos, and sharing your beautiful yards with us. And just a reminder that on August 21st, we'll be talking about plastic pollution. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@environmentamericas.org. So thank you very much. With that, we'll conclude our webinar, and we appreciate your time today and for joining us in taking action for the conservation of migratory birds.